And joining me now from Washington is Mark Leibovich. He's the chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine and a CBS News political contributor. I want to start with North Korea. Mark, what you're hearing this talk from Trump, clearly trying isn't really deterring them. So what's their strategy here from the White House?
Well, I think their strategy is not to get into a conflict with North Korea. That the status quo is really good for everyone except for North Korea itself. What was interesting about the president's remarks was that he seems to be channeling outrage through China. It's not just any kind of policy. He's saying they disrespected China. In fact, they disrespected, the wishes of much of the world, including the United States. So, look, I think there are clearly provocations going on. I think the president has been pointing that out, also pointing out that they fail, and this is sort of how it works. But I think as long as there's no kind of conflict or preemptive conflict, and it's unclear what he's talking about there, the status quo can hold.
He said he was going to, within his first 100 days, label China a currency manipulator. Clearly, there's been a 180 on the relationship with China. He keeps on saying how much he likes and thinks he's a good man, President Xi. How has that relationship changed the way he's approached foreign policy?
Well, it seems like they had a meeting. It sounds like it was a good meeting, and President Trump has repeatedly said that it was, he likes President Xi. They have a friendship. He's a friend of mine. The chemistry that he keeps talking about seems to be the extent of it. It's unclear if there are any sort of policy goals attached to it and whether they're actually in sync on these things. But yeah, he hasn't done that. It's no different from any number of other 180s he's done in the first, in the beginning of his presidency versus what he said he was going to do during the campaign and the transition.
Meanwhile, the 100-day mark, the New York Times headline reads, Congress at 100 days, frenetic action, but few accomplishments. We know Republicans control both chambers. We have a Republican president. So what's been the major roadblock here?
Roadblock to any kind of accomplishments?
That's
well,
right.
Not having votes, not having, any victories. It's stunning because you do have these alternative universes here going on where you have, virtually no legislative accomplishments to speak of except for possibly the confirmation of Judge Gorsuch, which is obviously a huge deal, but it's not legislative necessarily in nature, and really nothing else. So if you look at the president's sort of central campaign promises, I'm going to repeal Obamacare so fast, we're going to build a wall. I don't know if you consider lock her up a campaign promise, but any number of other things, currency manipulation, get rid of NAFTA. None of this has happened. Now, the question is, can he tout his way through this 100-day landmark? On one hand, diminish, the meaning of the benchmark, but also on the other hand, saying, I've never seen anything like it. I've gotten so much done. Quote Lou Dobbs in a tweet saying how great the 100 days have been, and hope that that will be enough for people. I think tangibly there's not a lot of accomplishments as far as, any legislative record to speak of just now. And I think the question is, how long will his supporters have patience with this?
You mentioned Judge Gorsuch, one of his major accomplishments, but even to achieve that mark, he had to just go through one chamber of Congress and had to have the rules change.
Right. that was, and you could see that as Mitch McConnell's victory, especially if you go back to how the Republicans were successful in really sort of holding up the nomination of Judge Garland under President Obama. So yeah, that's a significant victory. Again, how hard was that for President Trump? Someone, presumably, he was counseled that Judge Gorsuch would be someone that would be amenable to Republicans. He nominated him. McConnell did a lot of the dirty work, and he's now on the Supreme Court.
And meanwhile, the administration is cracking down on immigration, but about half of the nearly 700 immigrants that have been picked up since President Trump took office either had no criminal convictions or had committed traffic offenses. Is this a kept campaign promise?
Well, it's a kept promise in that he really made immigration the centerpiece of his campaign. His supporters were probably more rabid about this issue than anything else. And there is, whether it's fair or not, whether it's what he said he was going to do or not, it is a record of quote unquote getting tough with undocumented immigrants. Again, is that going to be enough? And the other question is, it's not really clear that this is where the country is. This is clearly where his supporters are. But if you look at sort of poll support for immigration reform or even for a wall, it's not, it's not less, it's considerably less than what people who voted for Donald Trump would say. So, again, people in their communities know people of undocumented immigrants who are being affected by this. It's unclear whether this will trickle down into some kind of public opinion.
A recent Washington Post poll found only 2% of Trump voters have buyer's regret. They still support him. And 96% do not. So what does this say about his base? They're still backing him, Mark.
Absolutely. It says that they're loyal. It says that they're fervent, and it says that, you know, he might have a little more time. I mean, the question is, I mean, he has been very successful in really blaming the media, blaming the establishment, blaming Washington, you know, to a much lesser degree, blaming Capitol Hill for, you know, not being able to get anything done. And I think that was a message that was central to his campaign that has been very durable in the early days of administration. Again, though, I mean, the question is, does that hold through the summer if there is still no you know, movement on, you know, on Obamacare, if there's no movement on a wall, and you know, or tax reform or some such. So, I mean, again, I think right now the warning signs are there, but I think, as you mentioned, the numbers certainly speak for themselves, and that this is a very, very solid and loyal base. The question is, can you survive if you lose any of it, but also if it doesn't scale at all?
You know, I look back at President Clinton and President Obama's midterms, and they weren't very beautiful in any stretch, as a term that Trump likes to use. Is there any way to gauge how the next midterms, which are just next week, might fare for the president based on what you're seeing, how loyal his base has been?
I think it's a little early. I mean, I do think that there's a bit of premature giddiness among Democrats to sort of talk about, you know, the grassroots is engaged, we're finally angry. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that less than 6 months ago, Democrats lost the mother of all elections, and that's what put them in this position. And a lot of this so-called energy that they're talking about now could have been better used then. So, I mean, they're in a hole. It's worth reminding people that they're digging themselves out of a massive hole. I also think they haven't won anything yet. I mean, look, they had a pretty good showing in a special election in Kansas. They ultimately lost by about 6 or 7 points. They're in a runoff in Georgia in a seat that a lot of people predicted them to actually being able to avoid a runoff with. So it's early. There certainly are signs of energy. There's big crowds. There's a lot of protests. So whether that translates going forward, whether that builds, I mean, I think will be the bigger indicator. But again, I think early on, it's a little premature to say.
And we know every president faces a learning curve. This president in particular said he thought it would be much easier. What do you think the biggest challenge has been for this president?
Oh boy, I don't know. I mean, I think, first of all, it's interesting. I mean, his remark about, you know, I thought it was going to be easier I would say it was pretty widely mocked in some ways. It's also kind of honest, maybe. I mean, I think, obviously, yes, there is a learning curve. I mean, it's not typical for presidents to show the kind of, I mean, I guess you could call that humility, right? I mean, you could see it as either humility or complete lack of humility. But either way, it's an acknowledgement. It's curious. But I think just knowing and getting used to the accountability of the office, seeing that he just can't get away with everything, the scrutiny which he has always both welcomed as publicity and tried to spin his way out of is, you know, it's intense. It just doesn't let up. And you also have a lot of checks and balances that you don't have when you're the CEO of a private company, beginning with Congress, beginning with ethical rules, beginning with much greater press coverage and so forth. So I think that's obviously a big thing to learn. And also, you know, there are a lot of variables that you can't control. I mean, I think one thing that people might miss about these early days is that it's been a fairly smooth ride as far as external events. I mean, I think North Korea is probably the one exception, but I mean, there haven't been any, you know, major, you know, foreign conflicts other than that, natural disasters, no economic crises. I mean, it's been a fairly stable time, and you realize that presidencies are largely defined by reactive forces and things that you can't predict. That was true with President Bush. That was true with President Obama. And I think undoubtedly before it's all over for President Trump, he'll have, you know, unforeseen crises to deal with also. So I think that will probably define him as much, if not more so, than what we're talking about now.
Mark Leibovich, thank you very much for joining us, Mark.
Thanks for having me.